On February 10, 2015, Dia Barakat, his wife of 3 weeks, Yusr Abu Salha, and her little sister Razan Abu Salha were murdered execution style in their apartment in North Carolina. They were all three college students. Dia went to the University of North Carolina, and the two sisters went to North Carolina State University. Now, this event personally scared me. It was terrifying because in a year and a half, I'll be a Muslim college student somewhere in this country, possibly very far away from home. And it's terrifying to know that I could be targeted because of my religion, that I could be killed because of my religion, like these three students were. Dia was known as someone who loved basketball, was an avid fan of Steph Curry, and overall, a very nice guy. He organized a dental supply drive for Syrian refugees living in Turkey. The sisters were known as American girls who liked going to the mall, listen to American music, and all three were Americans. And these were not three Muslim students that got shot. These were three American Muslims that got shot. They were fundamentally American. They were born here, grew up here. And they lived their lives here. They wanted to live the rest of their lives here. They wanted to create a future here, a family here. But that was taken away from them. Because of Islamophobia, we see a rise of Islamophobia affecting everybody. We see students like these being killed and being harassed all over the nation. Personally, I have experienced Islamophobia throughout my life, starting from elementary school, where I was excluded in the playground because I was Muslim, because family members of mine apparently did 9/11. And I was told these things at a very young age that I didn't even understand what they meant. But I always felt excluded. I never properly felt like an American, even though I identified as an American. I identified as someone who is an immigrant. Because I thought, and I was given the thought throughout school, that this was the land of immigrants, the land where anybody could come and make a life for themselves. And I considered myself an American who was born, or who was raised here, who wanted to live the rest of his life here. But I never truly felt that because of how I was treated by my peers throughout. And it never really stopped. The thing is, we get used to it. Just as anybody who gets bullied eventually just gets used to it. And it's not because it gets any easier, but it's just that we get berated so much and on a daily basis that it becomes something that's something that you expect. So you wake up every morning just mentally getting prepared for what lies ahead. Now, most often Islamophobia, the victims are students. They're young people who simply want to go to school, live an American life, grow up, they have their own aspirations. We see this Muslim couple living in St. Louis, Rabi Ayoub and his wife, Marwa Abdul Hussein, who were house shopping with their 4 children, when a man approached them with a handgun, approached the vehicle in which he was with his 4 children, and told him and his family, he said, quote, "You, your wife, and your kids have to die." Now, this is something that cannot happen. This shouldn't be allowed under any circumstance. And Islamophobia only feeds this kind of hate. Now, we later told news sources that his 2 youngest children were having nightmares about getting shot. I find that completely repulsive. I feel like that's not something that should happen to so many people around the nation. And it's simply unacceptable. And again, the people who are most affected by it are children. In our own city, in Sugar Land, in Fort Bend ISD at First Colony Middle School, a teacher called the student, this was last week after STAR testing, they were watching a movie, and he laughed at a joke in the movie, and his teacher basically said something that made him feel targeted, and she basically said, "You and your people are terrorists." Now, after this, his entire class laughed at him. They made jokes like, "Oh, he's got a bomb," and he felt completely awful. And I mean, how else are you supposed to feel when your entire class mocks you based off something you cannot control and something that was defined for you that you couldn't really choose? And events like these happen all across. And events like these have happened to me in my past and have happened to Muslim students throughout the country. And it's just something that happens. And what's happening is Islamophobia is simply feeding this. We see another example. In December, Faiza Osman was asked, a Muslim 8th grade student who wears hijab, was asked by a teacher if she had a bomb in her backpack. And it's simply ridiculous that adults, teachers in our country, people we should look up to are making comments like these, and that could affect someone for the rest of their life. Because these kinds of things you don't forget these things. Because not only is the teacher mocking you, but she's mocking you in front of your peers. She's mocking you in front of people that you want to be accepted by. And that's simply not happening. You don't get accepted. You are seen as an other. You're seen as somebody that doesn't really belong. We see another Muslim girl was called ISIS by a group of boys, put in a headlock, and they were trying to forcibly remove her hijab from her head. Now, I personally found this tragic because this girl was just practicing her religion and wanting to go to school, not wanting to be harassed by anybody, and they put her in a headlock and tried to remove her hijab and generalized her and called her by the name of a terrorist organization which she didn't believe in. Because it's a simple fact that 99% of the Muslims around the world don't advocate for terrorism, don't believe terrorism should exist, and frankly hate terrorism. Because if you look at the fact that a majority of the victims of terrorists are religious minorities that are also Muslim. That's a fundamental fact. And although there's many tragedies in the West, the vast majorities of victims of terrorism are Muslim. Next, we see that what's happening is this is only being fed, like this Islamophobia is only being fed by politicians. We see people like Ben Carson saying there should never be a Muslim in charge of the nation, and there should never be a Muslim president. And if I wasn't born in Pakistan and I was born in the United States, I'm pretty sure I'd run for president one day. But at the same time, we see that these comments that Ben Carson is making is automatically telling a bunch of children who look up to the president, who see that I could one day be a president, and it's telling them, no, you can't be the president of the United States because of what religion you follow. When specifically under US law, religion is not a precursor to office. You cannot ask for someone's religion as a criteria for office. But we see politicians making these comments, saying that Muslims are untrustworthy to be the president of the United States. Next, we see people like Donald, and he also compared Syrian refugees that are escaping persecution, that are trying to save their lives. He compared them to rabid dogs, saying that you shouldn't unleash a rabid dog in your neighborhood, just like you shouldn't invite Syrian refugees into the United States. People that are fighting for that are trying to survive in a country where they're in a war zone. And Ben Carson is comparing these people to rabid dogs. We see Donald Trump basically calling for a Muslim registry, a database of every Muslim, and having us wear ID cards similar to what Nazi Germany did when they committed the genocide of over 6 million Jews. Now, this is simply unacceptable that in the 21st century, politicians are making these comments. Next, we see Ted Cruz calling for specifically like the surveillance of only Muslim neighborhoods, such as neighborhoods that are predominantly Muslim. Now, it's unacceptable. When we're over-policing specific communities based off of religion, off of no past precedents, it's simply unacceptable that we do this in the United States. And all of this anti-Muslim rhetoric is only feeding Islamophobia. The politicians of our nation are supposed to unite our country, not divide us. Not divide us based off things that are trivial like religion. Things that shouldn't determine whether you should run for office, whether you should be able to be a free citizen of the United States. These things shouldn't be targeted, but we see politicians are constantly targeting these things. But let's look at a different thing. Let's look at Islam in general. So it's the second largest religion in the world after Christianity, over 1.6 billion followers, and it's 23% of the global population. So even statistically, it doesn't really make sense when you make the generalization that all Muslims are terrorists, because if there were 1.6 billion terrorists on this planet, ouch. That wouldn't be too great. So let's talk about terrorism. So according to the FBI, 94% of the terrorist attacks committed in the United States have been by non-Muslims. A vast majority of terrorist attacks are not committed by Muslims. That's a fact, even if you look at it in Europe, where over 1,000 terrorist attacks in Europe in the past 5 years, less than 2% were committed by Muslims. So again, Muslims are only making up a minority of terrorist attacks. What we see happening is the media focusing specifically on terrorism and painting it as a war on not only terrorism, but Islam in general. Painting the picture and blurring the lines between Islam and terrorism. Blurring the lines so everybody that is watching these news, everybody that's consuming this media has a mindset that Muslims are inherently evil or that Muslims want to cause damage, when that's fundamentally not the fact. There's 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, and there's barely any of them that actually follow terrorism or that actually preach terrorism or think that it's a good thing. Now let's look at it statistically wise. So the study by the University of North Carolina showed that you had a 0.0002% chance of Americans killed after 9/11 were killed by Muslims. So under those statistics, you're more likely to be killed by furniture and toddlers. So if you really suffer from Islamophobia and you're really afraid of Muslims, this next picture might scare you. So I'm sorry if you get scared. And I also don't recommend you ever walk into an IKEA because it's a lot of furniture in there. So again, it just doesn't make sense that so many people are affected by this Islamophobia, that so many people are afraid of Muslims, because statistically, it just doesn't add up. Next, let's look at some... Okay, so if we're known as a religion of terrorism, if we're seen as a religion that's generalized based off the actions of a few, then we should also be generalized for being peacemakers, because 5 out of the last 12 Nobel Peace Prize winners have been Muslims around the nation. So again, if you're going to generalize this based off a really small amount of terrorist attacks around the world, then we should also be peacemakers. Because Malala Yousafzai advocates for the rights of education for girls around the world. Because these people are creating a bright future for Muslims and for the entire world. We advocate for the treatment of women as equal. We advocate for these things, and the media and other politicians paint us as radical, as people who want to see the Islamization of America, America under Sharia law, which is actually ridiculous. And all of these things that the media tries to convey that a majority of 99.99% of Muslims believe are completely false. Furthermore, let's look at what impacts Muslims have had on the world. So surgery wouldn't be possible without the renowned doctor al-Zahrawi, who in the year 1000 illustrated a 1,500-page encyclopedia on surgery that was used for the next 500 years. In Europe, one of the most advanced civilizations used surgery methods created by Muslims in the Middle East. The first university in the world, older than Oxford, was in Morocco, when in the year 859, a young princess named Fatima al-Firhi founded the first degree granting university in the world, in Fez, Morocco. Furthermore, algebra. Al-Khwarizmi was considered the father of algebra because he founded algebra and he founded all the concepts that he founded a majority of the discoveries that led to the creation of algebra and basic mathematics. So again, computers wouldn't be very possible without the discoveries of Al-Khwarizmi because he created algebra and it was one of the biggest discoveries at the time. Furthermore, I think you guys are going to love this, especially as high school students and college students. Coffee was first invented by Muslims in Yemen in the 9th century. It was first made by scholars and religious scholars who used it as a method to be able to stay up and pray all night. But it was spread throughout Yemen when, of course, college students started getting addicted to it. So again, we see all of these discoveries being made by Muslims around the world. These impacts being created by the second largest religion in the world. And when we look at our shared future, we see that it must be a future in which we don't discriminate against certain religious minorities, don't discriminate against Muslims in America, where the media isn't biased and paints us all as terrorists, because that's not getting us anywhere. As previous TED Talks today have talked about racial equality and equality of different people throughout the world and different racial groups, we see that Islam is a fundamental part of that. We must learn to be equal if we have a shared future together. And then this shared future must incorporate all of us. Because I hope to join politics one day. And if I was born here, I'd run for president, Mr. Ben Carson. So again, we have to have a shared future where we connect to each other, where we don't discriminate, where students aren't getting their hijabs ripped off their head because they're Muslim, where students like me aren't scared to go to college because we might get murdered. Because Dia Barakat, Yusur, and her sister Razan didn't die for that. And they shouldn't have died. And they died because of the Islamophobia that's rampant and that's being spread throughout because of politicians, because of the media. And if we want our shared future to be bright and a future where everybody is treated equally, we must stop Islamophobia in America. Thank you very much.